I've been saying it for a while. Schools have become the new churches. And so schools provide daycare, food, clothing, social emotional learning.
That's Dr. Shannon Behan, who's back as a guest on our podcast this week. We love talking with Dr. Behan. She is the president of the BCPVPA, also known as the British Columbia Principal Vice Principal Association. Hi there, I'm Stan Baker, one of the hosts of Circle Forum, along with Shelley Steele and Steve Young. The demands on principals have grown exponentially while managing initiatives outside their normal educational scope.
This podcast is brought to you by the word complexity, from the Latin, which means entwined or woven together. Humans perceive complexity based on patterns and familiarity. Something is deemed complex when its patterns are unfamiliar or hard to discern. Interestingly, once individuals become familiar with these patterns, they often no longer perceive the system as complex.
Be sure to check out our website, www.restorative.ca, for ways to use restorative practices in your leadership to navigate those complex challenges that you face every day as a school principal. Let's join our hosts, Shelley, Steve, and me, Stan. In your talking to principals around the province, Shannon, you mentioned that the complexity of the job as principal is an issue that keeps coming up again and again. Can you talk a little bit about the problem, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the things that you and the association are suggesting as ways to address it?
Thank you. Lovely to be here again. I would say as I go around the province, I am hearing this reverberating echo of the demands of the job are getting to be overwhelming, and there's just so much. Schools, and I've been saying it for a while, schools have become the new churches. And so schools provide daycare, food, clothing, social emotional learning. We have here in BC initiatives for CPR training, naloxone training, all things that are really important to creating citizens in a community, all things that are really important. So I want to make it clear that I'm not saying it's not valuable, but the struggle also is that we're also really focused on improving outcomes for kids, which means teaching them the basics of reading and writing. And we know kids are coming into the schools maybe with added complexities that we haven't seen before. Maybe it's the COVID hangover, or a lot of parents have a tenuous relationship with school. But whatever it is, kids are coming in maybe with the inability to regulate as much as we have seen in the past. So all of those things come into play. And for most principals, I would say if you ask from anywhere around the province, the country, the territories, you can run your school if you work 55 hours a week with a little bit of experience in your back pocket. If you can work a minimum of 55 hours a week, then you can keep your school rolling. And that's just if you have anything extra, like at this time of the year, I used to do the Operation Snowball, the school dances, or the other beautiful things that schools offer. That's so you're looking at 55, 60, 65 hours a week. So then you try to also throw in some fitness, or maybe taking care of your family, or maybe providing some meals for people, like, or having a life.
Or having a life, yeah.
Yeah.
So
Definitely resonates. I became a vice principal back in the 90s, and certainly have seen the changes from the late 1990s up to when I retired in 2018. Just the number of new initiatives that were being taken on by schools that you go to staff and they say, well, that's not our job. That's somebody else's job. They're not doing it anymore. So now we're picking it up. Breakfast programs didn't exist when I first started in this role as a formal thing. I mean, there was a few schools doing it because they saw the need in their specific community, but as a whole, you didn't hear much about them. And then now they're just commonplace in every school. And so it's things like that social safety net. And I think, Shannon, you alluded to what the churches used to do, the schools are starting to pick up. And with every initiative, of course, that means somebody has to be responsible for it. And it usually falls on the principal's shoulders.
You know, it's almost an expectation now that there be a representative from the school or the board at any of these community initiatives, where it was before, did this connect to the school? Should a school rep be there? Now it's an expectation because it is all connecting to the school. And the interesting thing about many of these initiatives is not things that administrators have been trained in previously. It isn't something that they know about or have worked in, and they're being asked to, how are we going to administer having drug initiatives in the school?
So what kinds of things are you suggesting as solutions, or maybe just patches to the concerns that principals are raising around just the complexity? And I trained to be a teacher, not a priest.
Yeah. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Some school districts, so if you think about our breakfast programs, some school districts have aligned their hiring practices so that the breakfast program is added on to the workday or the hours of an educational assistant so that it's streamlined. Because the challenge is, and I mean, it's been my experience, you go into school, nobody's coming, the kids are hungry. So instead of preparing for the school day or thinking about what I'm going to do for a little needy Pete in kindergarten, I'm making some peanut butter toast for the kids. It's
Right.
wow butter. It's not peanut butter because you have to be careful of the allergies.
Yes.
It's a real
Yeah.
thing. And so it comes back to the policies and procedures that are system-wide throughout a district. First of all, there needs to be a recognition of the impact of these excellent initiatives that are on the backs of your school-based principals. And something like our EAs in many districts, the majority of the maximum time they have to work is about a 5 or a 5.5 hour day, maybe a 6 hour day. Some districts have seen the need to expand it to be a 7 hour position and then include the breakfast program in that, because the other piece is many schools rely on volunteers to run their food programs. And it is evolving, so we're going in the right direction so that they are paid positions. But relying on volunteers means that some days your principal, instead of being an educational leader, is making eggs on toast or cheese on toast or smoothie shakes for kids, which needs to happen for sure. And how do we voice that? That needs to be articulated really clearly to the senior leadership teams. Because sometimes what principals do is suffer in silence.
It certainly rings true in my experience that people don't talk about how busy it is or the fact that they need help. So who's going to ask? Who do we need to speak to make sure that the principals are being taken care of, to ask, how's it going?
We have to have it structured and streamlined so that it's not always on the backs of principals, because principals want to be educational leaders as well. And that sometimes is the first thing to move to the wayside when you're trying to support a child who's dysregulated, or you don't have enough EA staff or teachers to run your kind of that you would normally have on a typical school day. So that educational leadership piece and supporting teachers in classrooms, that's what immediately first goes to the wayside.
How does a restorative approach speak to the complexity of the work that principals are doing?
You always ask such good questions, and then I always think there must be a right answer. So I'm going to defer to Shelley and
No.
These,
we weren't ready for the
just
question.
so you know,
I'm
these
gonna
are
defer to Shelley,
open-ended
too.
questions.
I'm deferring to
no.
Shelley too. Go
Yeah,
ahead,
so,
Shelley.
so go, Shelley. I am actually referring
Oh
to
yeah,
deferring
Shelley
to
the
Shelley. too.
planner,
Yeah.
like
Yeah,
Shannon, that loves these questions on the spot. Steve, you go ahead for now. Start something.
The first thing that came to my mind was, we talk a lot in restorative practice about relationships. It's a relationship-based approach. And the best way to deal with stress is if you've got positive relationships with your staff, with your fellow colleagues. You could be a principal on your own in a school 15 miles away from the nearest school, but the phones are very close. If you develop that support network amongst your colleagues, but also on your own staff, when things are going well and times are good, that's when you build your relationships and your support network. So when the tough time comes, you know who you can fall back and lean on. And when you've got a shortage of EAs or support staff and a child's dysregulated and running down the halls and you're going to have to go after them, it's easier when you've got positive relationships with your staff and even your parents for that matter, hopefully, to say, I can't handle that right now. I'm dealing with this. Is it okay if you help me or you do this? And people are more willing to jump in.
Building on Steve's, the relationships, of course, but then how do you do that?
Yeah.
And it's stepping away and knowing that you do not need to manage this all yourself, right? That you have a team, and to bring them in on, this is now something we're going to be responsible for. How are we going to make this work? And the fair process will support that, but also just that people will trust then if you've brought them along with the different initiatives that, as Steve said, when things aren't going so well or you have to make a quick decision, they trust that you're making it with their interests as well, that you're not just up there making decisions, that you do understand what people are thinking and supporting, and then they'll support you as well when those times are tough.
Two thoughts that I would have to answer the question that I asked. One would be to make sure that there's a regular debriefing process as part of every situation that comes up, so that you get the people who are most affected by the overwhelm or whatever happens to be together and say, so what's been happening with this? What do you think about it? What's the hardest thing for you in all of this? And what do you think we can do next as a team? I think also making sure that approach of talking after an incident, but also before, is a conversation you have with your immediate supervisor, your district person, to say, listen, here are some of the things that I'm sensing are coming that may affect how things are going, or I'm really wrestling with this. And it's going to take some vulnerability on your part as a principal. Like, you have to be vulnerable with your supervisor to say, there's lots of stuff that I can do, but you got to realize there's 55 things you put on my plate now. Not just you personally, you being the royal you on the board, have put on my plate.
I guess I'm almost echoing what a lot of you are saying, like the distributed leadership piece is so important. And that was a big learning curve for me when I first started going into admin, especially I've worked in BC primarily. So it's been a unionized environment. So all of a sudden I'm popped out of the union, and then the teaching staff sees you in a different light, but you still have to really work hard to develop those relationships and let people know what you stand for, what your values are. Be vulnerable if you have to, and let the teachers know, I actually need your help here, or the support staff, I need your help. And when they know that you are there for the right reasons, you're there for the kids and the families and community, they will always jump in. And sometimes they might give you critical feedback after a situation, but they will always roll their sleeves up and jump in for sure. So it's that building relationships, building trust, building rapport, the distributed leadership piece. It's a hard thing to do as a principal. Many of us are type A. So sharing the workload is really important. And then my practice also, I was very privileged to have a vice principal in all the schools that I was at. And I would always take one day a week, it was usually Wednesday, would be my admin day basically. And so my vice principal would be at the front, support all the students who needed behavior support or teachers who need anything. And I could basically lock myself away and then do all the data reporting or the reports to the superintendent or the board or whatever I needed to do. And that was and of course I was 100% available for whatever they needed. And there were bonuses out of that because that gave the vice principal some experience, kind of real life training. And we would connect at the end of the day and talk about what went well or what didn't go well. And they would say, oh, geez, I really fouled up today. And I'd be like, okay, let's unpack it. So they get that experience in a really supportive way.
And here's the thing, if you do make a mistake, I mean, we do this with kids all the time. We learn from our mistakes. That's what we say to kids. You have to learn from your mistakes, but then you have to be willing to make a mistake and recognize that it's a mistake and then learn from it. And so demonstrating that for your staff, I think, would be a key element in building that distributive leadership, to let your staff know that, yeah, okay, this maybe wasn't the best call. Let's talk about how it impacted you, and let's see if we can do it better next time. To me, that's very restorative.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, here's a song we've sung before, about the importance of building strong relationships with staff, with parents, with colleagues. in a way to handle stress and distribute leadership. As Shannon points out, it's essential to explore practical strategies for delegating responsibilities and for streamlining processes with your boss, with your supervisor, or your superintendent. Failing to address this in school districts will lead to burnout among school leaders. Find out more about our work with restorative leadership that really does address the how-to of distributing leadership in your school building through restorative practices at www.restorative.ca. So like superintendents, do you know where your principals are at today?